Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our double podcast episode about the Angry Brigade, Britain's first homegrown urban guerrilla group. If you haven't heard it yet, we'd recommend going back and listening to part 1 first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
First off, just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to an exclusive bonus episode to this episode. Join us and find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Where we left off last time, the Angry Brigade had bombed the house of Robert Carr, the Conservative Minister of Employment, who was bringing in the Industrial Relations Act, which was aimed at preventing wildcat or unofficial strikes organised by workers themselves. It would also strengthen control over industrial action to official union leaderships and tie unions more closely to the state by mandating that unions officially register with the state. At this point it became clear that the media and authorities couldn't ignore the Angry Brigade anymore.
I suppose because it was new, they took it seriously. Given what's happened subsequently, you think, well, this. But at the time, they took it seriously and thought this was an attack on, and they couldn't pin it down. They couldn't pin it down to any known Leninist politics, or even I think to the extent there was a kind of established anarchist movement. They couldn't quite pin it down. I think they took it seriously for a while.
This is John Barker, who was put on trial for being part of the Angry Brigade. After the car bombing, other cabinet ministers got given security guards, and the Angry Brigade threatened to escalate their activities. They sent a communique to the Express newspaper, referencing the Prime Minister Edward Heath, declaring, quote, "The Angry Brigade is after Heath now. We're getting closer." End quote. Police Chief Superintendent Roy Habersham was in charge of the investigation to find the bombers. From the targets chosen, the language used in the communiques, and the type of explosives used, Habersham realised that the perpetrators were associated with anti-Franco exiles from Spain and were fans of the Situationists in France. Scottish anarchist Stuart Christie immediately came under suspicion. Christie was already well known to police, having been imprisoned in Spain in 1964 for his involvement in a plot to assassinate dictator Francisco Franco. He also lived with two men who'd been arrested for a bank bombing by the 1st of May group. And he worked as an engineer on North Sea gas appliances, the same components that Angry Brigade bombs had been made of. Christie was put under surveillance. He attempted to hide his address book, which contained all the contact details of his friends, at the house of a friend of his. Police somehow got hold of this book. Christie said that they stole it, and they then began investigating everyone in it. There were large numbers of anarchist and libertarian revolutionaries inside, including John Barker. Raids and arrests began on addresses linked to the libertarian movement and counterculture. These included the offices of Time Out magazine, which is now a huge global media brand, but at the time it was a radical, anti-work, countercultural journal. And some squats with young hippies living communally were raided by police, who were often bemused by what they found, as described by journalist Gordon Carr in his documentary, which we've made available on the link in the show notes.
During one raid on the offices of the magazine Time Out, special branch detectives had the embarrassing experience of having to explain why they were there on film.
Well, in fact, you're a member of the special branch, aren't you? I'm here as a police officer to do a specific job. There are official channels that you can go through, and I'm not one of them. But seriously, I think it's a bit... you can appreciate my position. How can I possibly say anything about it? I don't know the circumstances, and if I did, I wouldn't discuss them anyway.
The police were often shocked by the lifestyle of the people they raided. Some of the communes they went into were far from the standards of hygiene and organisation reached in Germany.
Well, obviously they didn't like it. I mean, it's quite clear. I mean, it was absolutely alien to their whole psychic, way of being. Police, they'd say, God, this is, You know, it's all this filth we've been talking about.
The office of the International Times, another radical countercultural magazine in which the Angry Brigade communiques got published, was raided, as did several other homes in London and Edinburgh. Many on the left claimed that these raids were political persecution, but this was denied by Habersham.
Well, this was a popular cry from the people that we were investigating, that we were merely harassing them for their left-wing views. This was not the case. As I say, I had to get amongst these people because the responsibility for the bombing clearly lay in this area. I had to get amongst them, I had to put my men amongst them, and my view at that time, and I still hold this view, that if people go about preaching violence and revolution, and a bombing of this sort occurs in that context, then they must expect to be the object of police attention.
On the 19th of January 1971, one arrest took place which would have serious consequences for the group, and it wasn't even related to any bombing.
A guy called Jake Prescott, who I did not know, was arrested, and subsequently it was discovered that he had a fingerprint on an envelope. So you say, well, this is because, you know, this group of people was so, in a way, informal, unstructured. I didn't know this guy, but I thought, fucking hell, you know, and then, you know, he's nicked.
Jake Prescott, just a week after the attack on Robert Carr, was picked up in Notting Hill on suspicion of being drunk. On him were 2 chequebooks, stolen, it transpired later, from students at Oxford University. On remand at Brixton, Prescott began to boast about his knowledge of explosives, his contacts with the Angry Brigade.
Jake Prescott's fingerprints matched a print found on an envelope containing an Angry Brigade communique. Prescott was from Fife in Scotland, whose mum died when he was 6, and he grew up in an orphanage. He worked in jobs like mining and on a farm. He got involved in petty crime as a teenager, like stealing bikes, and was in and out of Borstal, that is, youth prison, for the rest of his youth. As an adult, he got addicted to heroin and continued to be in and out of prison. One day, in Albany prison, he met Ian Purdy. Purdy came from a middle-class background and had been to boarding school. He was active in opposing the Vietnam War, and he'd been arrested and imprisoned in 1969 for throwing a petrol bomb at the Colonial Ulster office during an Irish civil rights movement protest.
Purdy struck up a friendship with Prescott and began to interest him in politics.
He realised that one could
Ian Purdy.
change from struggling as an individual, which he's done all his life, struggled against his conditions, struggled against things that he's been subjected to, but as an individual, and he realised, I think, that struggling collectively is more coherent. Struggling collectively has more strength, has more power, and this leads further into struggling with his class, which is basically how he did change, I think, or how his attitudes changed, how he came to realise that there were different forms of struggle.
After getting out of prison, Prescott started living in communes and got involved in the Angry Brigade. After Prescott's arrest, rather than go to ground and lay low, as you might expect, the group decided to step things up.
Again, this is kind of a bit suicidal. You say, well, look, I don't know this guy, but he's an ex-con. You know, we can't let him, go down. So we must now carry on. And if we carry on, then he can argue that, that in fact it was a thing. I mean, this was actually, as it turns out, a bit suicidal, but that's how it transpired.
Several more attacks took place in the wake of the arrest. Meanwhile, police decided to release Prescott and put him under surveillance.
As the picture emerged and as our inquiries spread, of course, it became quite evident that responsibility for these bombings clearly lay within the circle of acquaintances that Prescott had. And we discovered that in this same circle lay responsibility for much of the fraud that was going on too, so that this, as it were, underlined our conviction that the people we were after were within Prescott's circle.
With Prescott's address book, Habersham was able to narrow the field of suspects from virtually the whole of the so-called alternative society to some 50 or 60 people. Each one came into the frame as a possible Angry Brigade candidate.
In February, the home where John Barker and his partner Hilary Creek were living in Manchester was raided by police looking for explosives. and Prescott was formally charged with conspiracy to cause explosions, including at Carr's home and the Miss World contest. Meanwhile, the AB put out a sixth communique criticising the, quote, shoddy alienating culture pushed out by TV, films and magazines, and the, quote, ugly sterility of urban life, and the, quote, daily exploitation of our labour, end quote. It drew attention to strikes that week by workers at Ford, the post office and elsewhere, and violence by British police in Northern Ireland, declaring, quote, the CS gas and bullets in Belfast will be in Derby and Dagenham tomorrow, end quote. Dagenham being the home of Britain's biggest Ford plant. The following month, March, Ian Purdy was charged as well with involvement in 2 Angry Brigade bombings. But the bombings continued. On the 18th of March, during a big strike by Ford workers, a bomb exploded at the main Ford office in Ilford, just outside London. The Angry Brigade issued a statement claiming responsibility and celebrating the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Paris Commune. Over the next couple of months, more attacks took place, some definitely linked to the Angry Brigade, including a bomb sent to the right-wing Times newspaper which didn't go off, and a bomb which did go off in the trendy Bieber boutique in Kensington. The communique issued after the bombing of Bieber was a very classic situationist-style text. It denounced the trendy retro 1940s fashion revival, declaring, quote, in fashion, as in everything else, capitalism can only go backwards. They've got nowhere to go. They're dead. The future is ours. Life is so boring, there's nothing to do except spend all our wages on the latest skirt or shirt. Brothers and sisters, what are your real desires? Sit in the drugstore, look distant, empty, bored, drinking some tasteless coffee, or perhaps blow it up or burn it down. End quote. A few weeks later, a bomb went off at the Metropolitan Police Computer Centre. An Angry Brigade communique claimed responsibility and criticised murders by the police themselves, like that of David Olawale, a Nigerian British man killed by police in Leeds. Then, during a dispute at a Ford factory over the dismissal of a union shop steward, John Dillon, the AB bombed the home of William Batty, Ford's chairman. Meanwhile, John Barker, Hilary Creek and 2 others, Anna Mendelsohn and Jim Greenfield, moved into a flat together in Stoke Newington, East London, paying around £37 a month in rent. Mendelsohn and Greenfield had already been arrested for cheque fraud, but they'd skipped bail and were living underground. This was necessary because of the group's criminal activity, but it very much went against the politics of what the group wanted to be.
There's obviously a contradiction, and in a way that's why, why we got nicked. I mean, never mind failure. And there is obviously, number one, we didn't have enough. I say we. As a group of comrades, the Angry Brigade did not have enough criminal nous. Actually, able to do cheque fraud, but not really having the criminal nous that you need. And 2, it was a very, clandestinity in a way is completely opposed to what should be libertarian communist politics. There is a contradiction here. And in a way, this contradiction, I don't believe the comrades of the Angry Brigade ever resolved. They were too open to not wanting to be kind of an elite clandestine sort of saying, oh, well, come and join us, we'll show you what to do, and you get on with it.
While life underground made sense for urban guerrilla groups like the Red Army faction, which saw themselves as a vanguard which would seize state power on behalf of the working class, it really didn't make sense for the Angry Brigade, who wanted to see themselves just as young people, part of the working class along with everyone else. But this just isn't possible when you're going out bombing government ministers and capitalists, as anyone could potentially report you to the authorities. By this point, the police investigation was extremely intense, with multiple ongoing lines of inquiry. There was a specific case against Purdy and Prescott, there was a fraud case about the cheque fraud, there was a special branch investigation into the bombings, and there was a forensic side to the case, looking at the explosives themselves. Facing such a sprawling and complex investigation, the police brought everyone together into a single investigating team of around 40 people, which was dubbed the Bomb Squad. Still, the bombs continued. On the 15th of August, a bomb went off at the Territorial Army Centre in Holloway, North London. An Angry Brigade communique claimed responsibility in solidarity with the fight against British colonialism in Ireland. A few days later, on the 21st of August, the Amherst Road flat was raided by police on a warrant about cheque fraud, and Barker, Creek, Mendelsohn and Greenfield were all arrested. Stuart Christie happened to visit the house while police were there, and he got arrested as well, as was Christopher Bott, another libertarian socialist who was friends with John.
Well, raid's obviously a shock, in Stoke Newington top floor, there's no way to get out. There's a lot of them. And we're taken to Stoke Newington police station, which was then a Victorian building, not like the kind of hotel frontage they have now.
Notorious.
Notorious, and I got quite seriously knocked about in there. And as Stoke Newington police station has continued, to this day to be a notorious place for people.
The brutality of officers at Stoke Newington police station was well known, and there have been instances of suspicious deaths there, perhaps most famously that of Colin Roach, a young black man who walked into the police station one day, then died after a single shotgun blast. Police claimed that he killed himself, but his friends, family and the local community all disputed this.
And then we got moved to a police station in Albany Street, which was then the centre of what was called the bomb squad, got knocked about a bit more.
The police were attempting to force the arrestees to confess and to implicate each other in the Angry Brigade attacks. They used all the usual kind of police tactics in such cases, from violence to deception, saying things like other arrestees had already confessed and implicated you, so it would be in your best interests to cooperate.
The usual, even though we didn't have much criminal nous, we all knew that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We said no comment,
no comment.
No.
Certainly in the UK, saying no comment is always the best advice if you're ever arrested, which is what John did. Remarkably, however, the Angry Brigade had never actually discussed what to do if they were ever rounded up.
No. I wish I could say yes. Wish I could say we were more professional, sophisticated. No.
In the raid, the police claimed to find a cache of guns and explosives in the house. According to John, the police were attempting to frame them, but in his case, they were framing someone who was actually guilty.
Yes, that's what happened.
While John said nothing for the most part, some of the others did give some information according to the police, like Jim Greenfield, who allegedly admitted to bringing a parcel back from France. But this was later disputed in court by the others. In those days, police interviews weren't recorded, and so police verbaling, as it was known, that is, making up fake confessions, was a common occurrence. Stuart Christie said nothing and demanded to see his solicitor. Police told him that they'd found detonators in the boot of his car. Christie denied that they were his. The group were all charged with conspiracy to cause explosions. Because Purdy and Prescott had been imprisoned on remand for so long already, they had to go on trial first, separate from the rest. The main evidence against Prescott was testimony by 2 other prisoners, to whom he'd supposedly bragged about his involvement in the Angry Brigade, and his handwriting being on 3 envelopes containing communiques by the group. The only evidence the police had on Purdy, however, was that he had the same political views as Prescott, and he tried to run away when police tried to arrest him. After a 3-week trial, Prescott was convicted of conspiracy, but cleared of conspiracy to cause explosions, and Purdy was cleared of all charges. The judge sentenced Prescott to 15 years in prison, which was labelled as a, quote, exceedingly severe sentence by the Guardian newspaper. 2 more people were soon arrested, teacher and lesbian activist Angela Weir and art student Kate McLean, bringing the total number of those facing trial to 8. They were dubbed the Stoke Newington 8, and a mass campaign in their defence began. When the trial eventually started in early 1972, it lasted over 6 months and became the longest criminal trial to date in UK history. The primary charge was conspiracy to cause explosions, with 10 others, including possession of explosives.
In my trial in 1972 of causing 25 explosions in which nobody was hurt except one lady got a scratch on her legs. That was which I regret. Anyway, so there was an explosion at the employment minister who was introducing the Industrial Relations Act. There was an explosion at his house. There was an explosion at the house of the general manager of Ford Britain. There was one this was during the course of a Ford strike. There was one at the home of the Trade Secretary, and amongst many various other targets. We had the Stoke Newington 8 defence group, which brought together people from completely, families, all, incredibly mixed, who were absolutely brilliant, were producing bulletins.
As well as the defence group bulletins, the trial was reported in detail each week in the counterculture publications like Time Out. The defendants did everything they could to try to turn the criminal proceedings into a political trial.
Jury selection. I say this now, we had an absolutely wonderful solicitor called Michael Seifert, long-time member of the Communist Party, big communist East London Jewish communist family, fabulous guy, fabulous solicitor, who fought, did incredible things for us, and he helped us use this. There had been a precedent called a Mackenzie ruling, where you were allowed to have friends who could work in a kind of supporting legal role.
These Mackenzie helpers could then aid the defendants, taking notes, giving advice, and being a supportive presence in general. The best way the group thought that they could draw attention to their politics during the trial was for some of them at least to defend themselves. Often in criminal trials this is a terrible idea, but as we saw in our episodes 33 to 34 about Asian anti-racist youth movements in Bradford, England, with political crimes, having some defendants represent themselves can be extremely powerful.
This was, we had been given a precedent for this by the Mangrove trial, in which a very fine man, Darcus Howe, recently died in Brixton, who was one of the defendants in the Mangrove trial, which was a trial of black activists in and around a Mangrove restaurant in Notting Hill on some, really cheapskate conspiracy trial, and he defended himself, and nearly everybody got off. So we had this example, and in a way it was obviously not just to present both our politics and ourselves to a jury of 12 people, with this thought that the jury is the one institution in this country where people have actually political power. Real political power. By defending yourself, I think you have a possibility of directly speaking to the jury, and the presumption was that the jury is the crucial thing they're the people who make the decision, and you want to give them confidence in this situation, and also you want to. It's easier, I think, if you're defending yourself, not to come across as a cipher, like being defended by a professional who tries to get you off.
In the courtroom, the Stoke Newington 8 Defence Group also organised logistical support.
Wonderful people were doing transcripts so that we could counter their transcripts, and certain legal precedents were made in the trial, which unfortunately I think have now been all backed off. First was that we challenged the jury about politics and even about class, I think.
In the jury selection process, the defence challenged potential jury members about their political views and their class background. The defence asked questions including whether the jurors were members of the Conservative Party, if they had relatives serving in the British Army in Northern Ireland, and whether they would be biased against people with anarchist or similar political views. In the end, they were pretty successful. 17 potential jurors said they would be biased. The defence challenged 37 potential jurors, and 2 were challenged by the prosecution. This left 12 jurors who were mostly working class, and 5 of whom were unemployed and claiming benefits, like many of the defendants.
Those precedents were important, and the support of our support group was brilliant, and they started to articulate their own politics, and in a way I think it was the Stoke Newington 8 solidarity campaign was more politically right on than we were.
John was one of those who represented himself in the trial.
I defended myself, yeah. Well, the basis of the defence was that I had been fitted up.
In addition to the central charge that the defendants were framed by the police, the defendants also decided to challenge every aspect of the legal procedure. So rather than a conspiracy to cause explosions, They charged that the police, the prosecution, the law, and the court system was all specifically aligned against them in a much bigger conspiracy in the interest of the capitalist class. To support this claim in court, they cited the work of General Sir Frank Kitson, a leading military official working for the Ministry of Defence who wrote a book called Low Intensity Operations, which was a counterinsurgency manual for the government. In it, he wrote that the law, rather than being a neutral arbiter of differing interests, as governments typically claim it to be, in fact, the law, quote, should be used as just another weapon in the government's arsenal, and in this case, it becomes little more than a propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of the public, end quote.
So it was a lot of actually, all that, things you see on TV and try, actually niggling around till you found contradictions, which contradictions did emerge. And at the same time, even in the way that one asked questions, hopefully your politics came out. If you're defending yourself, and obviously you can't then, have you defended yourself, you can't say, I'm not going to go in the witness box, I'm not going to be cross-examined by the prosecutor. So you've got to, so you go in there, and that's another opportunity actually because you're dealing with the prosecutor who's an adjunct member of the ruling class, let's call him. And so you're dealing with this again, and again you're trying to push a certain, a confidence that you don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be this to stand up. And so the trial did go on a long time because there was a lot of evidence, there was a lot of contested evidence, and then we had a lot of very wonderful comrades and not even comrades who came and spoke up for us in various different ways. And then we made our speeches in a summing up at the end, and I put a lot of work into that thing, and I hope that we expressed that are basically anti-elite, and really trying to express what anti-elitist politics meant. It meant it did mean, yes, we had a hatred for the ruling class, but at the same time this was because of their stinginess in relation to development of working class movement, which we then, when we try to give examples of this and what we try to do and so on and so forth, and to express, I hope, a libertarian communist politics.
One particular advantage of having some defendants represent themselves meant that defendants like John could essentially give some testimony while questioning witnesses. For example, John got to question the officers who raided his house and pull apart inconsistencies in different accounts by different officers. These inconsistencies offered the possibility of a period of 6 or 7 minutes in which defendants were walked out of the home, then walked back in and shown the weapons and explosives. The clear inference being that this was plenty of time in which the officers could have planted the evidence. After months of evidence and legal wranglings over technicalities about what constituted a conspiracy, it was time for the defendants to take to the stand themselves. They used the opportunity to spell out their politics in great detail. They didn't deny being sympathisers with the Angry Brigade, although they did say that they disapproved of their methods. For example, Jim Greenfield, who went first, stated that he disapproved of the tactics of the AB because, as far as he could see, they did nothing to advance the cause of the working class. Probably the most damning piece of evidence against the defendants was that the duplicator which was used to print all of the Angry Brigade communiques was found at the Stoke Newington flat. Their response to this was that 2 people connected to the AB had used it in their flat to print the last communique, but they wouldn't name those people to the police. One thing which damned the defendants to an extent was the rather unfortunate fact that since they'd all been locked up, the Angry Brigade bombings had stopped. In his detailed closing statement, which many professional lawyers were very impressed with, John attempted to address this, arguing that perhaps the AB had come to see bombings as irrelevant, especially given the huge escalation in class struggle which had happened, including national strikes of builders, which we talk about in our episodes 65, 66, and miners, which we discuss in episode 81. Finally, after 109 days, the jury retired to consider their verdict on the 4th of December. The following day they told the judge they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, so the judge said he would accept a majority verdict instead. At 5 p.m, the jury came back with that verdict. With a majority of 10-2, the jury found John, Jim Greenfield, Anna Mendelsohn and Hilary Creek guilty on the main count of conspiracy. But they unanimously acquitted Stuart Christie, Christopher Bott, Angela Weir, and Kate McLean. Greenfield and Mendelsohn were acquitted of 2 attempted bombings, but they, John and Creek, were convicted of possession, meaning the jury didn't accept the defence argument that the explosives were planted in the Amherst Road flat. But the acquittal of Christie meant that they did believe that the detonators had been planted in his car by the police. In a highly unusual move, the jury requested leniency from the judge for the 4 that were convicted.
So yes, at the end of six months with 4 was quite an extraordinary moment. In fact, obviously disappointed to be going to prison at all, but it was an extraordinary moment when the foreman of the jury very nervously said we would, having convicted 4 and given not guilties to the other 4 people in the dock, also then said that they wanted to recommend a level of, I didn't say leniency, but some kind of something like this, and that saved me 5 years. So I was supposed to get 15, which is what in a previous trial Jake Prescott had got 15, and I got 10, and I'm eternally grateful. The jury, in which I know there was certain, I found out afterwards there was some negotiation in the jury, and I think I'm pretty sure to say that the 2 members of the jury with black skins held out for us all to be acquitted, and it was a compromise.
Right.
But I'm very grateful to them.
Because of the request for leniency, the judge deducted 5 years from each of the sentences, meaning that the 4 got 10 years each, with additional sentences for other offences like possession to run concurrently, meaning they didn't result in a longer sentence.
Yes, I think we got an incredible result. As I said before, I think the strategy was correct, but I'm still very grateful to certainly some people in the jury who stood up for us. And I would say to anybody facing any serious political trial, I mean, obviously sometimes you think, oh well, maybe you should plead guilty and get it out of the way, or whatever. But I would say in any serious thing that at least one person in one of those kind of situations should defend themselves.
The sentence reduction for the 4 also had a knock-on effect for Jake Prescott.
Fortunately for him as well, because of our jury, his sentence was also cut from 15 to 10.
As soon as John went to prison, pretty much straight away he got involved in organising and protests inside. So did other members of the AB, like Jake Prescott, who took part in a major prison uprising in Hull. We talk more about all that in our bonus episode, available for our Patreon supporters. John has said he finds it painful looking back over the things he did now over 40 years ago, but he has written about it. In a review of a book about the Angry Brigade by Tom Vague, which very much tries to glamorise the group, John wrote that he doesn't regret what he did, but he is critical and not wholly sympathetic to it.
I don't disrespect who I was, I don't disrespect what I did at all, but I'm not going to say, this was the best thing to have done.
He acknowledges some of the cringy, over-the-top rhetoric of the group's communiques, and with the benefit of hindsight, he realises how foolhardy they were to continue with their activities after Purdy and Prescott got arrested, and all of their contact details were available in their address books. Their activities did also bring a level of oppression down on the libertarian left scene in London with the raids and arrests, but not everyone was that fussed about it.
Well, it depends who you ask. I mean, a lot of people will say, well, you fucker, you've brought down repression on us and, but so on. I mean, Stuart Hall would say we caused the collapse of the movement in the 70s. It's a slight exaggeration of our importance. I mean, some people would say, well, you brought down repression on... But by and large, as I discovered in prison, people thought, yeah, good.
Stuart Hall was a prominent British-Jamaican sociologist and activist. The Angry Brigade actions all took place at a real turning point in British history.
In the month that I was arrested, which was in Stoke Newington, which was in August 1971, in the same month, Nixon suspended the dollar from the gold standard, which was, I think, crucial building block in the whatever you want to call it, neoliberal capitalist counter-offensive. It was a building block in this thing, and in the same month, internment, that is to say, imprisonment without trial, without any proof of wrongdoing, was introduced in the north of Ireland, which was being asserted as being part of Britain. So that in Britain they introduced a system where you could be put in prison without any evidence. So these two things happen. They're very different on a very different scale, but they happen in the same. Things were moving at this time.
And the government was trying to make significant moves to reduce the power of working class people.
One of the Angry Brigade actions was against the Industrial Relations Bill, which was, I think, the first. I mean, you can say that the Heath government actually, and you look again in retrospect, and you say, well, the Heath, a bit of a wuss, didn't quite do it. But at the time, this was a serious attempt, actually, to start an attack on union rights.
As we discuss in more detail in our episode 81 about the 1970s miners' strikes, which ended up bringing down Heath's government, he was unsuccessful. But this was the beginning of a right-wing neoliberal counter-offensive, which in the end would take until the 1980s and the government of Margaret Thatcher to actually begin to be implemented successfully. Looking forwards from his lifetime of activism, we asked John what he thinks is most important for us to think about today in terms of trying to organise as workers and as a class to make things better.
Lots and lots and lots. I think what's really important now is a kind of real assertion of basic principles, solidarity, these kind of basic socialist principles actually have to be, I think, strong. That is one thing I would say. Also, very important, I think that's what's so impressive about the various strikes by cleaners, has been looking about where you can win.
Here, John's referring to a wave of successful organising mostly by outsourced migrant workers employed as cleaners in London over the last decade, which has had a number of significant successes.
You don't go and bash your head against the wall. You look at situations where you think you can win and you think strategically. So, for example, there are some instances where, so my stepdaughter, who's involved in NHS struggles, Virgin are now going to get a nice slice of the NHS. Now, are Virgin susceptible to any degree of shame? I mean, then you think about, say, there have been campaigns, for example, with Sainsbury's, and Sainsbury's are slightly susceptible to shame.
The rank and file unions mostly involved in these efforts, like the United Voices of the World and the Independent Workers of Great Britain, have been organising at very ruthless private sector outsourcing firms, but where they have been engaged by parent employers with an ethical or luxury facade, such as liberal universities or supposedly ethical retailers like John Lewis.
The weak, plus, yes, that assertion of principles and actually trying to live a socialist life to the extent that you can within the parameters that we have to live in.
John also thinks there's been a significant shift to the left among certain sections of the public, which we can take advantage of. Part of which was indicated by the amount of support shown for Jeremy Corbyn, the left-wing leader of the Labour Party, who announced he'd be stepping down in late 2019. But at the time we spoke to John, Corbyn was still in his post. And while he has gone, his supporters are very much still around.
Jeremy Corbyn, the new Labour leader, big flamer, kind of libertarian communist organisation in the 70s and 80s, they had this notion about political space creation, and I do think Corbyn has created a political space in that and then you can't say, that's reformist or that's this or the other. You then have to use that space. I mean, we as sort of comrades have to use that space, and I think that's at this moment that's really crucial. That some things that you couldn't even there is still a space in which you can talk about. Trident, as an example, is complete lunacy.
Trident is a replacement for the UK's current nuclear weapons system. Despite the fact that the current nuclear weapons system has never been used, the government is proceeding with bringing in a replacement with an estimated cost of £205 billion.
everybody knows it's completely pointless. I mean, really, you think about it, isn't it? But I think that there is a, there is a space, and one has to use it, particularly on housing. I mean, it looks to me as though I've been a council tenant for 30 years or so, and actually, relatively speaking, I'm privileged to have a council tenancy, and it's really interesting. For example, I think they're called Acorn. There's a load of groups who seem to be non-sectarian now, pushing for the rights in the private rental market. I think these things are important.
Acorn is a self-organised direct action group for private renters, which has affiliates in various cities around the UK, as well as other countries like Canada.
I think Labour has will have all kinds of contradictions about housing, and they want to keep up property values as they all do, and so they will. But there is the space to push. You have to push them.
While the Labour Party aren't in government at the moment, Labour councils do run most inner city areas, and it's they who are carrying out policies of social cleansing. That is, forcing out poor working class residents and spearheading the gentrification of those areas.
I was peripherally involved in the Broadway Market squat, which is when the Hackney Council really showed their social cleansing colours.
This was a months-long campaign in East London where local residents occupied a cafe which was due to be demolished and converted into luxury flats in an area which was at the front line of gentrification in Hackney at that time. Perhaps ironically, this sort of community organising and activity which John is involved in and supports now was the same as he and his friends engaged in before forming the Angry Brigade. Like the claimants' unions which fought for and won real victories for unemployed people and tenants, and the community campaigns which took back private land, like Powis Square, whose park and playground is still publicly accessible today. These were ultimately more revolutionary than the actions with guns and bombs.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
This brings us to the end of our main episodes about the Angry Brigade. We've got an exclusive bonus episode for our Patreon supporters, where John talks about his time in prison, his involvement in prison protests, attempted escape, and involvement in the Winter of Discontent strike wave after he got out. Our patrons can listen to that now and get loads of other exclusive content and benefits at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. It's only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you do appreciate our work, please think about joining us. If you can't spare the money, do not worry about it, but please do tell your friends about this podcast and take a second to give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your other favourite podcast app. We've got some great books about the Angry Brigade as well as an excellent documentary DVD, all available in our online store, link in the show notes. We've also got John Barker's novel Futures, set in Thatcher's London. As a listener to this podcast, you can get any of these and anything else in our store 10% off using the discount code WCHPodcast. John has also written other books like Bend the Bars and Criminal Justice Acts. These are all available on his website, theharrier.net, link in the show notes. As always, we've got lots more info on the webpage for this episode, linked in the show notes. This includes sources, links, transcripts, as well as a Radical London playlist John Barker put together for us, with a curated collection of tracks that were popular in the scene at the time in London's clubs and communes. Thanks to our Patreon supporters once more for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it in the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Tyler Hill. Thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
Tu mi devi seppellire lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella